Hello everyone, just a quick disclaimer before we get started. I don't claim that my builds are the best in the game, and I'm sure there are better ways to optimize some of them, but be aware that I do tend to get my builds at least endgame viable. This includes things like arbitration, steel path, eidolon hunts, etc. Now that this is out of the way, these timestamps have been left here and in the description for your convenience. Feel free to skip around, but I'll start with the basics first just in case people don't know how to play this frame. Okay, so starting with the stats. So the armor on the prime is 150, while the non-prime is 125. So you're looking at a 25-point increase going to the prime. In terms of damage reduction, this is 33.3% damage reduction and 29.4% respectively. For energy, you're looking at a base of 150 energy for both. This is 225 at max. Health, you're looking at a stock 100 for both. This is 300 at max. For shields, you have 125 for prime and 100 for non-prime. A 25-point increase between the two puts you at 375 shields and 300 shields respectively. For sprint speed, you're looking at 1.1 for each, which is pretty solid. The difference between the two isn't that great, but of course if you want the best possible stats, the prime is the way to go. Normal Ember is found from farming the boss on Saturn, and Ember Prime is vaulted at the time of creation of this video, so you'll need to dust off some old relics or pay someone a pretty penny for it. Okay, moving on to abilities, starting with the passive. So receive 5% ability strength for every enemy within 50 meters engulfed in flame. So this is pretty straightforward. So if I have 10 enemies on fire within 50 meters of me, I'll have an additional 50% power strength, and this does apply from other people setting things on fire as well. So if I just go set a bunch of enemies on fire really quick, as you can see in the top right, I get my buff. And that is power strength. Okay, going to her first ability, Fireball. So charge and release a fiery projectile that ignites enemies on contact. So damage is of course affected by strength mods. Radius is affected by range, but it has a pretty pitiful base range. Combo window is affected by duration, and this guarantees a fire status proc, and enemies on fire take double damage from the ability. Charging the fireball increases its damage by up to 500%, depending on her immolation level, which we'll get into shortly when we cover the second ability. In my opinion, this isn't really worth hitting because of her fourth ability and the fact that most weapons are better in every way, but it is spammable, which helps her second ability get charged up, which I will explain now. So, immolation. Protect Ember with flame armor that burns stronger over time, consuming energy once its meter is at full strength. Cast again to extinguish the flame. So the armor they refer to is actually a flat damage reduction, which actually applies to shields as well. So when you cast it, you'll get the bar to appear, and the higher that is, the higher the damage reduction, up to a cap of 90% with some power strength. Before we get into it, just bear in mind the drain over time is affected by efficiency and duration, and it only starts to drain at a full gauge. So if I get in here and I press 2, as you can see, it starts at a very low gauge and it's very, very slowly climbing. Okay, so in order to raise it, you can cast your first ability, which raises the heat generation by 1% per second every cast. So if I just keep doing that, it'll of course bring it up faster and faster. Additionally, you can cast Ember's fourth ability, which raises it by 3% per cast every second, but we'll get into those other abilities later. In order to reduce it, you need to hit Ember's third ability, which decreases the heat generation by 2% per second every cast, and just pretty much gets rid of a bunch of it. The point is if you want to slow down your heat accretion, you obviously want to be hitting 3, and if you want to raise it, you hit 1 and 4. So basically while you play, you need to micromanage this bar to prevent the energy drain from becoming too egregious, raising it and lowering it to strike a good balance of energy drain and damage reduction. This is easier than it sounds, and our third ability gives you plenty of reason to lower it often. As you can see, the longer I hold this, the faster it goes down. And as soon as I have enough energy and I decide to press 3 to lower it, you see the energy drain over time stops momentarily. At least until it goes back to max percent, in which case it resets and it'll start draining a little bit slower as soon as it hits it. So as you can see, we hit cap again, and now it's slowly going to start draining again, and eventually, the longer I hold it, as you can see, it starts to go down faster and faster and faster. Again, this isn't hard to manage, as long as you are keeping an eye on that bar. Alternatively, you can just click it off and restart, and that'll give you a fresh bar to work with. Just keep in mind, it's going to be a while until you can get your damage reduction back up to snuff. Okay, so third ability, Fire Blast. We've already touched on this a little bit. Slam the ground to create a shockwave of incinerating plasma that knocks back enemies and strips their armor. So of course the reason they give you to hit this is to slow the heat accretion, and really for the armor strip, you can achieve 100% armor strip at a full gauge. Try not to be fooled by the percentage on the gauge though. As long as you aren't negative on power strength and the bar is full, you will get a full 100% armor strip. Using this to keep under a full bar will mean you aren't getting energy drain constantly. And of course, when enemies are hit, they are given a knockdown effect as well as a guaranteed status effect. So this is a pretty good crowd control. So moving on to Inferno. So command a flaming comet to crash down in front of Ember, engulfing enemies with a fire that can spread through their ranks. So as you can see, it costs no energy to cast, which means you can hit it regardless of enemies being around. However, if there are enemies in range, it will consume a set amount of energy per target. The damage is split 50-50 with impact and fire, which does actually help against shielded targets. It means you're not doing pitiful damage when heat hits. The comet leaves a guaranteed damage over time on the target that lasts a set amount. This is seen by a growing ring around an enemy. The ring around each enemy grows to a radius of 5 meters, which is affected inversely by duration. So if I have negative duration, the ring grows to that 5 meters way faster. The damage over time from the ring does more damage with a higher immolation heat level. As you can see, it says damage per second, 350 to 700. That is depending on your heat level on immolation. Okay, moving on to her ability augments. So Fireball Frenzy is for her first ability. Fireball Augment, hold to cast, will grant all allies within 15 meters an additional 100% heat damage to their attacks for 40 seconds. This is, of course, affected by range and duration and even strength for the extra heat damage. And as you can see, I just hold the cast and it gives that damage. It's very nice. It's just, I have a hard time finding a slot in my builds for this, so I just don't use it, but it's very similar to the augments that Volt, Saren, Oberon, and Frost have, and probably other frames too. I just can't think of them at the moment. Going on to her second is Immolated Radiance. Allies within affinity range will receive 50% of Immolation's damage reduction. So this is also really good. It's just, again, it's just hard to find a slot for it. It's very straightforward. So if I have 90% damage reduction, your allies are receiving 45% of that. Moving on to Healing Flame, which is Fire Blast Augment. Each enemy hit heals Ember by 25 to 50, depending on current immolation level. And this is pretty good because this does scale with strength, as well as the immolation level. So if you had 200% strength and you were at max immolation and you hit this, you would do 100 health, which per enemy. So that's a lot of healing. This is a pretty good augment. It basically means you don't need to, have operator arcanes to self-heal or things like life strike. It's pretty solid. Purifying Flames, Fire Blast Augment. Allies hit by the expanding ring of fire will be granted 4 seconds of status immunity. This is a Conclave Augment. In regular PvE scenarios, this one is a total bust. There are better ways to get status immunity, like Titania's Assumed Ability for Helminth. This is just not worth using and definitely not worth the slot. Exothermic is a Inferno Augment. Enemies killed while under the effects of Inferno have a 15% chance to drop an energy orb. This is really good. This 15% chance is definitely higher than it is stated. I think it stacks additively with the energy drop chance already on enemies because I get energy orbs to spawn a lot more than 15% with this augment. These orbs also drop for teammates, which can be insane to help your team. This is definitely a good augment. So at this point in the video, I like to answer the question, is this frame Steel Path viable? Can it run arbitrations? Is it part of the Eidolon hunts? Probably not great for Eidolon hunts, but for just about everything else is definitely a big thumbs up. The armor strip and decent damage from Inferno, as well as being pretty tanky, really helps in just about all aspects of the game. I would definitely recommend this frame. So let's move on to the build. Okay, so for my build, I basically went with a tanky approach with a good amount of just about every stat. The idea here is to just be able to set everything on fire and still be tanky enough to use, weapons and stuff should we need to. In terms of Helminth, I personally use Roar, but technically you don't need Helminth. Her kit works as is, anything else is just a bonus. There are other options you can use, like Pillage for more tankiness, since we know shields work off of her damage reduction that she gets, and Snare to make enemies, keep setting each other on fire, which is pretty strong. And I even see some people using things like Firewalker to leave fire trails and increase sprint speed. These are just some options out of the many possibilities. So in terms of pharma, you're looking at 5 pharmas. It's actually less if you are using regular Ember. I think it's only like 4 actually. You'll add 3 Neremans and a Zenuric on Prime. One of these will need to replace the default Vazarin she comes with. Additionally, add 1 more Zenuric in the Exilis slot. So going over the mods, we're starting with Growing Power. This basically just gives us more strength, which we're already packing so much strength from our passive. Why not just have some extra? Going on to the first 2 mods, we're going to be using Umbral Vitality and Intensify to buff each other to give us strength and health because, of course, she's pretty tanky. It doesn't hurt to have the health. The next mod is Healing Flame. Of course, I went over this with the Augments. It just heals every time she hits 3 and hits an enemy. She's going to be hitting 3 a lot, so why not just have some healing as convenience on the side? Alternatively, you could put something in like Augur Reach to bring your range up even further. Technically, it's really not needed unless you're on, Plains of Eidolon or something like that. Next mod is Prime Continuity. We want to counterbalance fleeting expertise as much as possible. Having a totally negative duration isn't the best thing to have on her, and having too much duration just really isn't needed. Of course, we have fleeting to give us ability efficiency, and this does bring down our duration a bit, which is why we have Prime Continuity. I have this 4 out of 5 simply because I didn't want to add another format just to be able to fit Healing Flame. So if you do use something like Augur Reach, you can actually make this 5 out of 5, so you're getting the full efficiency. The negative duration really isn't that impactful. Prime Flow, so we can just bank a ton of energy. This is pretty obvious. She is constantly hitting powers. She needs to be able to have some in reserve for when she is being drained by her 3. We have Stretch for extra range. Of course, our 4 and 3 go off of that range, so it's pretty important to at least have some. Exothermic to just give a ton of energy to ourselves and teammates. We need a lot of energy, but maybe our teammates do too, and this does affect them, so it's pretty strong. In terms of Exilis, I have a 4 out of 5 Power Drift just for some extra strength. Technically, you don't need this, but the reason why we do it is because, of course, we can't fit everything if it's totally maxed. Going over Arcanes, we have Arcane Guardian. I do this for the extra armor, even more tankiness. This is pretty strong in my opinion. You can get her closer to like 80% damage reduction with this, maybe even higher. Arcane Energize, we're going to be picking up a lot of energy orbs. We might as well have this as an added bonus. It is pretty expensive. If you don't have this, maybe consider something like Eruption, which is a lot easier to get and actually gives stuns every time you pick up energy. We're going to be picking up a lot of energy anyway, so this is just an option. It's not a great arcane, but it works pretty well with her. Moving on to some misc requirements, we have basically, we just want heat on pretty much everything. And, Glaive is the only exception because it's overpowered to begin with. The more things you have with heat, the better. And if you're curious about my Ignis Wraith build, this is it. And of course, I'm using her signature secondary, which is Sicarus, also using heat and viral. This is also pretty strong. Moving on to Operator School, we're obviously using Zenuric. If you're having trouble with energy, I definitely recommend something like this, especially if you don't have Arcane Energize. Moving on to a quick how to use, so obviously we want to start with giving ourselves some energy and pressing 2. This will give us our damage reduction and it'll start charging up for our armor strip, which is very important, especially since we're going against such high levels. So we press 4. As you can see, our conflagration buff is pretty high. We're going to press Roar now that it's being buffed. Technically, if you're using Growing Power, which you really should be, you can shoot first, and as soon as an enemy is affected by status, you'll have even more, so that, of course, goes even higher. So, this does a pretty decent job at killing things and dropping a whole ton of energy orbs. So, now that we're at a full armor strip, let's go against something a little bit tankier. So, heavy gunners seems like a good idea. So we're going to press 3 to strip absolutely everything. Press 4 again. Of course, we're going to keep our buff up. And as you can see, things die pretty quickly when they don't have armor. That is pretty much all there is to it. I'm going to go into some gameplay now so you can see how this works in action. Alright, so right when I get in, I press 2 to give myself damage reduction. I start setting things on fire with 4. And then once I'm comfortable with how many I have, I give myself Roar. And then I'll keep pressing 4 until my buff is very close to max damage reduction, as well as being able to start armor stripping, and then I'll just start armor stripping everything. And that's pretty much how that goes. So I'm going to go back just into another rotation that I did later. So I start setting some enemies on fire. I'm killing things with my Ignis as well. So I strip some stuff, press 4 a couple times. I'm comfortable with what I have on my buff, so I use Roar. And that gives me an 85% Roar, which is pretty solid. So obviously, if you don't have Roar, you could just use something else, but I like to have the extra damage buff. So that is the end of the complete Ember guide. She is pretty damn good. If you enjoyed the video or it helped in any way, please leave a like, and if you're looking forward to future content like this, subscribe and stay tuned. If I missed anything or you'd like to leave some feedback, leave it down in the comments. I appreciate all the support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.